To contemn the world and to enjoy the world are things contrary to each other. How then can we contemn the world which we are born to enjoy? Truly, there are two worlds. One was made by God, the other by men. That made by God was great and beautiful. Before the fall, it was Adam's joy and the temple of his glory. That made by men is a babel of confusions, invented riches, pomps and vanities, brought in by sin. Give all, saith Thomas à Kempis, for all. Leave the one, that you may enjoy the other. Let's talk about public goods, one of my favorite shops out there for basically all basics. Anything that, you might imagine needing to buy on the regular. Typically, if you need like dish soap or you need toilet paper or whatever, right, you go to the grocery store. But what happens then is you get confronted by these rows and rows of really weird, like sort of chemical colored products that you don't really know. First of all, they don't look all that great in your kitchen, but second of all, you don't really know what's in them. I'm kind of a health nut, and so public goods is great for this. Their soaps especially look really great in your kitchen or in your toilet. The toilet paper and shampoo and just all the basics are there. Plus, fun extras like tea and pet food. And Chad Cat loves their freeze-dried duck nibs, which I just love to say every time I do a public goods ad. I'm very excited to say freeze-dried duck nibs. But they also make snacks for humans too, in case you happen to not be a cat. And you can get all of this for $15 off with no minimum purchase on your first order, which is a great deal just for Young Heretics listeners when you go to publicgoods.com/heretics or use the promo code heretics at checkout. That's publicgoods.com/heretics for $15 of free public goods stuff. Now, I would bet that that's not a very familiar quote to most people listening. It's from the Centuries of Meditations by Thomas Traherne. And Traherne is somebody very near and dear to my heart, although only recently has he sort of come into my purview. C.S. Lewis called this the most beautiful book in English. And when I started reading it, I have to say, the cynic in me wanted to resist. I sort of wanted to be a little bit more skeptical of it or to be judgmental about it. And it's funny how that works when somebody tells you this is the most beautiful thing in the entire world, right? You have this kind of resistance. But I have to tell you that Traherne conquered my resistance altogether. I am completely on board. And as it happens, Traherne, in this kind of providential way, I always say that God prepares my reading lists. Traherne is a perfect complement to the conversations that we have been having about quantum physics and perception and how to understand our relationship with the outside world. And this is because he, in some ways, it's been said, he preempts the romantic poets whom we've discussed on this show with my dad, no relation, Andrew Klavan, right, have this theory of the imagination and the mind, that in seeing the world, viewing the world and experiencing it as rich with value and beauty and also, sorrow and suffering, even the negative qualities, all of the qualitative experience of the world, that man puts the final period on creation, that our role as images of God in creation is effectively to consummate the act of creation. And I've been arguing that this is actually perfectly analogous to what quantum physics is beginning to uncover or suggest to us, right? The idea that even the particles of our world outside, which we think of as these kind of small gods, right, that behave immutably according to these, neat laws forever and ever, amen. And even when we're not looking, they behave exactly the same way, right? It's actually much more strange than that, right? This kind of Cartesian division between our observing mind and this matter that moves around, right, is starting to break down, as indeed it must, because in fact, as we know, right, all of our categories for even describing and taking measurements depend upon the mediation of human consciousness. When we say or think or casually assume, right, that the particles behind us are bouncing around or whatever, we're using all of these visual images or ideas that don't even obtain outside of human perception, right? Things like color or vibration, right? These all have qualities that that are mediated for us, right, by our what the Greeks would have called our aesthesis, that is the sensory perception that we have, and that we can't help but be in this kind of relationship. And it turns out that when we're not in that relationship with the outside world, it's not that it is. It's not that it doesn't exist, and it's not that it has no stable reality at all. It's that its reality completely thwarts and frustrates all of our categories for seeing and understanding. And it's only in relationship with our consciousness that it takes on those sort of those final categories. And I've talked about this in at some length, so I won't belabor it more, but it is incredibly suggestive in part because, one of the things that seems to be emerging about this way of understanding the world is that, look, so you have these particles, right? They do these weird things, like they behave, they have wave-like behavior and they have particle-like behavior. They also kind of seem to they have many different possible locations, and yet they can't really be said to be in any one of them or even in both of them, but rather they have a property related to location that is not the same as the property of being in a location, right? These things are, again, beyond our language because they inevitably, they don't have our categories applied to them yet, right? And yet, one of the things that is starting to emerge that might be the case is that this idea, which is called decoherence, quantum decoherence, that as particles interact with one another, right, they become entangled, which means that information about one of them is, not localized in it, but rather in the other particle, right, and that we know about the other particle by knowing about this particle. And as those particles enter into that relationship, right, they take on the kind of stable character that we experience when they enter into relationship with our consciousness, which is, right, the kind of the act of observation creates one of these circumstances in which now the outside world is kind of bound with our minds, right? One of the reasons why that is happening even when we are not around is because there's ambient light in the universe, right? Even in the farthest reaches of space, a photon or two is there to effectively create this form of decoherence and to kind of resolve some of the indeterminacy of the world, which means effectively that light holds the world together, right? It's almost as if in the beginning, God said, let there be light, right? Like it's almost as if. So all of these things are like, so, the gospel story the Bible story of Genesis describes the world that science is discovering in poetic terms, of course, right? But describes that world better than the scientism that we have invented, which is basically an inheritance of the 16th and 17th centuries, that is based on this kind of Cartesian dualism combined with this Baconian empiricism, right? The scripture turns out to describe the world better than that kind of abstraction that we have of ourselves as these detached observers and the world as this kind of toy machine that moves according to deterministic rules. All of this is spiritually expressed in the scripture and was coming to be understood by people like Traherne in the 17th century. He's a 17th century writer. And so this is exactly the same time, right, when Protestantism and the birth of modern science are beginning to set us down the path that has now ended in a form of crisis, right, a form of reductive materialism. And so he's a great person to visit after we've talked all about Barfield, because in some ways, he is the proto-Barfield. And of course, since the Inklings, read him, he informed a lot of the sort of spiritual attitudes of the Inklings. So I'm going to try something a little bit new here. And that is that I'm going to, and I again don't know, as usual, I don't know how many episodes this is going to go for because there's so much to say here, but I'm going to take us through a chapter of the gospel, which I believe is perfectly Trahernian, or rather, Traherne helps us understand in a new way the mysteriousness of this chapter of the gospel. And I'm going to go line by line and talk to you about the Greek of the gospel, and then bring Traherne in to kind of talk about the meaning of these sayings of Jesus, and then using that kind of as a baseline, I will continue to move forward into the Romantics and the modern period and so forth. So That's what we're all about here. This, to me, this is some of the most crucial intellectual work to be done in our time, because we have come up against such an unsustainable crisis, a kind of schizophrenia in the way that we talk about these things. We recognize these facts about quantum physics, and yet we're doing everything we can to avoid the implications, the philosophical implications that they thrust upon us, because of our commitment to this kind of classical physics model of the mind having no relationship or just being yet another piece of meat. All right, let's get into it. Let's talk about anti-woke tea with Gold River Trading Company. I don't think I ever thought I would say those words, and yet I'm delighted that I get to. Gold River Trading Company is this really awesome brand that I've been enjoying for a while now. They make just tea, which is excellent in its own right, and that's not easy to do, especially stateside. The Brits are kind of known for their tea, but they make this American breakfast blend, the 1776 American breakfast blend, which is so nice. Sips really smooth. They also make a chamomile herbal tea if you're not that into, caffeine and all that stuff. But on top of all of this, you can also trust that they are not going to take their money that you give them and hate on you. Because these woke corporations, right, they engage in these terrible initiatives, these sort of, racial recrimination initiatives and just these, fealty oaths to the new regime of woke madness. And Gold River Trading Company doesn't do any of that. They love America. They are American branded. And I trust them to be tried and true in that. So goldriverco.com and use the promo code Heretics. When you go to goldrivercode.com, you can get 15% off when you use the discount code Heretics. One more time, it's goldrivercode.com and use discount code Heretics for 15% off. So the gospel passage that I'm going to read through with you today is Matthew 6. And those of you who know your New Testament fairly well, which, by the way, doesn't have to be you. You could be coming to this completely fresh, and that's absolutely fine. We have lots of people who have, I'm overjoyed to say, we have lots of people who have encountered and discovered the Bible for the first time through this show. So I will just give some basic background for those that don't know. This is part of what's called the Sermon on the Mount. And it's in Matthew, early on in Matthew, sort of shortly after Jesus' baptism and his time in the wilderness. Jesus emerges into the world as a preacher and starts drawing all sorts of attention, good and bad, to himself. And then he withdraws onto a mountain, and people come to hear from him. And he raises up his eyes, and then he embarks upon, in the gospel, this sermon. So it's called the Sermon on the Mount because it's on a mountain and it's a sermon. And there have been, you can engage in all sorts of scholarly speculation about whether this is a sermon he frequently gave that has been sort of synthesized into this one kind of rendition, whether it's many different sayings of many different times of teaching that he would regularly come to this mountain. My default is always just to accept it as the gospel tells us that it is, because I suspect that you're more likely to go right that way than indulging in modern skepticism. But be that as it may, we have this text, right? And it from it come all sorts of things that we know very, very well, right? Things like if you look at another woman in lust, you have already committed adultery, right? The Lord's Prayer comes from here. We're going to get into the Lord's Prayer because it's in chapter 6, but it's more than just chapter 6. It's several chapters long. But this is the one that contains some of the most, to me, mysterious sayings. Things like the eye is the light of the body, right? What the heck does that mean? And I think that by the time we get there, and by the time we've been talking about Traherne and some of these concepts of perception long enough, I think we're going to know what that means, or we're going to, unlock new meaning in it. Let's put it that way. And this kind of thing can help us to recover the urgency of something like the Sermon on the Mount for our modern scientific age. So let's begin at the beginning. Matthew 6, verse 1. And I'm going to make quite a bit of reference to the Greek. On Locals, at youngheretics.com/locals, I do a lot of readings in Greek, and people seem to enjoy that. So I thought I'd do some of it here too, because the Greek of the Gospels can be very beautiful. And so I'm going to read that, but I'll also, of course, make reference to the English, and we will use the Greek to kind of understand some of what's being said here. So, verse 1, take heed, prosechete, tein dikaios unein humon, me poien em prostenton anthropon, pros to theathenai autuis. Eidemege mistan uk ekete para to patrichumon to entois uranois. So take heed that you do not your alms before men, your dikaiosune, which is your sort of, it's your righteousness, right? But here it's a kind of charity, right? You do not your alms before men, improstenton anthropon, to be seen of them. This is important, to be seen of them. Otherwise you have no reward of your Father which is in heaven. Therefore, when thou doest thine alms, do not sound a trumpet before thee, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, that they may have glory of men. Verily, I say to you, they have their reward. Apechusin ton miston auton. They take home their reward. But when thou doest alms, let not thy left hand know what thy right hand doeth, that thine alms may be in secret. Hapos su he masune ento krypto. Now, this is interesting because in the Greek, we have two different words, dikaiosune and masune. Masune is kind of mercy, right? Your mercy or your charity. Ento krypto, in the hidden places, in hiddenness. Kai ho patersu, ho blepon ento krypto, apodose soe. Now, this phrase, ho blepon ento krypto, he who sees in the hiddenness, he who sees in what is hidden. This is very important, right? Because again, mysterious saying, let not your left hand know what your right hand is doing. Be unaware of your own actions, right? What can this possibly mean? Well, let's understand here the difference between these two kinds of seeing that are happening here. And it doesn't come across in the translation. Many translations that I looked at when I was getting ready for this episode didn't really get this across. There are two kinds of looking being done here. There are two Greek words being used, and one of them is the looking of man, and one of them is the looking of God. The men who are looking, right, those who do their alms before men to be seen of them, right, and prostenton anthropon, prostotheathenai autois. This is a Greek word, theoreo, to be seen of them. Theoreo, it's where we get our word for theater, right? And theatrical metaphors are everywhere in the gospel, right? The hypocrites, the hypocrites are the actors. It's also where we get our word for theory, right? So this is the kind of looking, right, that sort of sees an artifice, right, that understands or contemplates something that is prepared for your viewing, right? The outward show of things, the external vision of things. And this is quite distinct from what God is doing, God is blepon, right? And blepo is a much more direct kind of looking, right? Blepo is like, it's actually more physical in some ways, right? It's like to see, if I see the computer in front of me, right? That's blepo. And I don't really need to theoreo it. I don't need to contemplate or consider it. So what does this mean, right? It's that God is engaging in a kind of direct sight, but it is of that which is entokrypto, right? That which is unknown, that which is not present to the senses. So on the one hand, right, people are watching you do your alms, they're watching you present your bread to the hungry or whatever, and you're blowing your trumpet and you're making a big deal out of yourself. Everyone knows this kind of behavior, right? Everybody's done this kind of thing. Well, it's not for me, it's for the children, right? Off I go doing my great works, right? And this form of display, right, is like an outward show. It's like an actor performing. It's something that we are supposed to take a certain thing away from, right? You're supposed to look at somebody behaving this way, and when you theoreo, when you look at it, and you contemplate it, you're supposed to take something away about that person, right? Distinguish this, right, from not letting your left hand know what your right hand is doing. Well, how can that be? Well, when you're really doing charity, right, what's charity actually about? It's about the other person, right? It's not about what anybody else might look at you and think about, right? The spectators looking and doing the theorein, right? It's not about that, right? It's about the person in front of you and what that person needs. And sometimes doing good to that person, right? The spectator might think of you as actually a very nasty, ugly person. I mean, we talked a couple of weeks ago about the kind of love that obtains within a society in order for it to function, right? And showing love to your fellow citizens sometimes means, right, closing down your borders and things like that, which other people might condemn as nasty and call nasty, right? But if you're really thinking about what's best for the person you're trying to benefit, right, you're not actually thinking about this other outside observer, about the outside show. And so suddenly this loss of self-observation comes in, because if I'm thinking about what you're going to theorein, right? What you're going to see, then I'm inherently turning my gaze back upon myself, right? I'm looking at me and I'm saying, what do I look like to that guy? And what's he going to consider and contemplate and theorize about my motives and my desires and me, right? Always looking inward at me and thinking about what that guy is seeing from the outside. When I'm really doing charity, right, I engage in a kind of forgetfulness of self, right? And so the left hand does not know what the right hand is doing. I'm no longer even thinking about what it looks like, right? It might not even be visible, right? So I'm not doing it, and it becomes therefore enkrypto, right? It becomes an inward attitude, and that is what God blepe. That is what he looks right at, right? He sees, his vision is of a kind that is so pure and entire and direct that he looks at the things that we can only see mediated through a glass darkly, right? We've talked about this all the time, that like we have this kind of mediated relationship with reality that comes to us through our senses. And what the scripture is effectively saying here is that God's sight, that our physical sight is like a kind of, derivative or an analog for the kind of sight that God has, which is direct perception, blepo, right? To see right into the thing that you can't see when you're really doing it, right? Because when you're really doing it, you're not inwardly focused, right? And so God, who sees you in secret, will reward you publicly, right? Reward you openly. This is completely consonant with the way that the Old Testament also talks about this issue. In particular, in 1 Samuel 16, a very famous moment when God has sent Samuel, the kind of prophet, or the last judge, you might say, the kind of end of the judge period. He's had to anoint Saul, who was the king demanded by the people, and God gave them this king to show them what a disastrous mistake they had made. But now that the king has kind of gone off the rails, he's going to anoint another king to kind of take his place, and that's going to be King David, right? So that's what's happening, is that Samuel has had to kind of sneak out, right, under cover of espionage, for fear of his life, right, for fear that this kind of unhinged monarch is going to take offense. And he visits in Bethlehem, a city that you may have heard of before. He visits in Bethlehem this guy Jesse, who has many sons. And the sons walk before him, right? They come and parade before him, right? And it came to pass, this is verse 6, it came to pass when they were come that he beheld Eliab, this is one of the sons, and said, surely the Lord's anointed is before him, right? Ach, neged Adonai, Mishiachu. The Lord's anointed is the Messiah, right? So this is a word which we use in its highest form about Jesus or about the Savior, right? But this is something that is just regular for Hebrew scripture to talk about people who are anointed. Cyrus is the Lord's anointed, right? But the Lord said unto Samuel, Vayomer Adonai, El Shemuel, look not on his countenance or on the height of his stature. Al tabet, right? Al tabet, right? Don't look at. This is another kind of. It's almost like theoreo. It's peering, right? It's looking at the outside show. Al tabet, look not. Al morehu, at his countenance or the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For it is not as man seeth, right? Ki lo asher yire ha'adam. It is not as man seeth, and ha'adam is the kind of earthy name for man, right? It's the man from the dust, right? For man looketh on the outward appearance, but the Lord looketh on the heart. And this is, again, a place where the translation doesn't quite capture what we're getting at here, right? Ki ha'adam, for man, yire, seeth, le'enayim, with the eyes. Va Adonai, yire, seeth, right? Same word here, la levav. And this le, which is a prefix in Hebrew, which is being translated here as with, right, has a million different meanings, and all of those connotations are present, right, in any use of the word. So you could say he seeth with the eyes. You can say he looketh on the heart, right? You can say he looketh after the manner of the heart. There's a kind of a heart looking, and there's an eye looking, right, or a seeing. And both are distinguished from gazing, from peering upon the countenance, the stature. So the outward sight, right, is again distinguished here from the inner sight of the heart. And this is blepon, right? This is God's looking in secret at the thing that you can only do if you're not looking, right? The thing that you can only do when you are outwardly engaged, when your whole sight is placed upon the brother in front of you, the person in front of you, right? And you've achieved a kind of self-abandonment that abstracts away from the theorein of the world, from the looking of the world, right? then, right, you are actually starting to become an object of God's sight. You have entered into a whole new way of looking at the world, which is about forgetting yourself and seeing what's really in front of you, and God seeing you, right, as according to the sight of the heart, right? This is the key. This distinction in kinds of seeing, and what seeing means, is the key to Traherne, to the Centuries of Meditations. And now this is an amazing text. It seems to be incomplete because they're called centuries because they're divided up into sections, 100 sections each. And so you have 4 complete centuries, and then you have a 5th century that seems to break off in the middle. But it was only really uncovered in the 19th century, this text. And so it kind of had this renaissance, and Traherne himself has had this renaissance and being rediscovered in all these like obscure manuscripts and little, antiquarian shops and stuff. So a good reason to always go to used bookstores, because used bookstores have treasures in them. Sometimes you find a real treasure. And that's basically what happened here. So let's read now, as I'm making this distinction between blepon and theoreo, right? Between looking and seeing, looking according to the outside, and seeing according to the inner heart, right? And the godlike seeing, which is the vision that only God has, which is vision unmediated by kind of the outside show, which we are only able to attain or to imitate when we're not looking, right? When we're kind of so outside of ourselves, so focused on the other in front of us, the need of the other person, that we're not diffracting ourselves back to look at ourselves or to look at the other people. Okay, here's Traherne. You guys, we have a new sponsor, Cozy Earth. These guys have changed my sleep game. They were created to enhance people's lives by offering the softest, most luxurious bedding in the world. They have over 5,000 5-star reviews, and they deserve them, man. I am not a great sleeper like my father before me. I kind of get very excited to start the day, and so I don't sleep very much, or I just kind of toss and turn. But Cozy Earth sheets are really helping me with that. They're super comfy. It's important to get a good night's sleep, and actually helps you, obviously, to be more effective throughout the day. Comes in white along with 4 natural colors: light gray, driftwood, charcoal, and oat. And for a limited time, you can order their bedding in 2 new colors, olive and navy. So whatever color palette, vibe, aesthetic you've got going on in your bedroom, they've got something for you. Whether it's their best-selling luxury sheets, ultra comfortable loungewear, or new bath collection, you will love shopping there. I guarantee it. Go to cozyearth.com/heretics and save 35%. Just for my audience, cozyearth.com/heretics. Save 35%, all backed by a 100-night sleep guarantee and warranted against piling, discoloration, and shedding. cozyearth.com/heretics. So we're here in the 3rd century. We're going to skip around in this text a little bit, although it merits pondering and contemplating throughout its whole progression. But in the 3rd century, he gives us a kind of apologia de vita sua, right? He gives us kind of a description of his development and how he came to what he describes as a total spiritual awakening, a total recalibration of his understanding. And here's section 59 of century number 3. The image of God implanted in us guided me to the manner wherein we were to enjoy. How is that God has given us the world to enjoy, right? What is this manner? For since we were made in the similitude of God, we were made to enjoy after his similitude. Now, to enjoy the treasures of God in the similitude of God is the most perfect blessedness God could devise. For the treasures of God are the most perfect treasures, and the manner of God is the most perfect manner. To enjoy, therefore, the treasures of God after the similitude of God is to enjoy the most perfect treasures in the most perfect manner, upon which I was infinitely satisfied in God, and knew there was a deity because I was satisfied. For in exerting himself wholly, in achieving thus an infinite felicity, he was infinitely delightful, great, and glorious, and my desires so august and insatiable that nothing less than a deity could satisfy them. One of the nice things, Michael Martin writes a really nice short little intro to this text, and one thing he says is it's not that Traherne doesn't believe in original sin. It's that he thinks the way to achieve the Christian life and the Christian attitude is not to focus constantly on your own objection, because that's just another form of self-regard, right? Just another, oh, woe is me, oh, I'm so low, I'm so bad. The point of even absolution is to reorient the mind, right? What Paul calls a total renewal of the mind, outward toward God. And this is a 180 shift, right? It's a binary flip at the beginning. That's why I read that crucial passage at the beginning. Give all for all. Scrap one way of looking at the world entirely in favor of another, right? This spectacle, once seen, will never be forgotten. It is a great part of the beatific vision. A sight of happiness is happiness. It transforms the soul and makes it heavenly. It powerfully calls us to communion with God and weans us from the customs of this world. It puts a luster upon God and all his creatures and makes us to see them in a divine and eternal light. I no sooner discerned this, but I was, as Plato saith, in summa rationis arche quies habitat, seated in a throne of repose and perfect rest. And we're going to come back to this Plato thing in a second, but the translation of the Latin is, in the highest citadel of thought, repose lives. All things were well in their proper places. I alone was out of frame and had needed to be mended. For all things were God's treasures in their proper places, and I was to be restored to God's image. Whereupon you will not believe how I was withdrawn from all endeavors of altering and mending outward things. They lay so well, methought, they could not be mended, but I must be mended to enjoy them. Whew, okay, so much is in here, and let me see if I can begin to unpack it. You can see that we're working our way toward an understanding of this idea that the eye is the light of the body, right? What can that mean? Well, the inward light, right, which is the kind of corresponding thing in us to what God's light is in the world, right? This idea that, as I mentioned at the beginning, right, that light holds the world together, that the kind of baseline or the foundation of creation is light, right? Has its analog in us in the outward direction of our seeing. And our seeing is made to be pointed out at creation, at our brother, and to see is to enjoy, right? So to delight in something, which is actually not that easy to do, even though we think it's super basic. We always sniff off like, oh, yes, just, it's so naive and simple to delight in nature. Well, it's like, okay, so if it's so easy, wise guy, why don't you do it, right? Like, why not go out? So here's the thing, and we're going to get in a second to, it may not be in this episode, but we are going to get to what happens when things suck, right? And this is kind of, it's like we're taking the easy part first. Because the hard part is, well, how does any of this work when you're down on your luck, when you're suffering, when everything is awful, right? And Traherne has lots of great things to say about that. But one thing that reading Traherne really made me think about is, well, okay, that is definitely a kind of next level challenge, right? And it's going to come down ultimately to Traherne's belief that Christ on the cross is the highest manifestation of God's love, right? But it's like, well, if you're definitely not going to achieve the highest level challenge if you can't achieve the first level challenge, right? If you can't get past your ABCs, or if you can't beat the first level of the video game, then you're not going to have the power-ups that you need to beat the boss, right? So why would we begin from the hardest and most exceptional version of this question? And why wouldn't we begin from the real question, which is, okay, so you walk outside, there's a sky, right? And grass. There's things that are actually good. And the thing about them is that they fade, and Traherne talks about a lot about this, they fade into the background because they're everywhere and they're always with us, right? They won't always be, but they are in our whole lives. The grass is always out there. And so we forget that they're completely contingent. They could not be. They could have been totally different. There could have been no grass, no sun, no light, right? What if, right? And so once you see that, and once you understand that what you're looking at is the object of somebody's delight, right? This is what he means by seeing the happiness of God. To see happiness is to achieve happiness, right? Once your sight is directed toward the action of God in the world as creator, you're suddenly oh my gosh, this entire spectrum of delights, right? And Lewis talks about this in the Screw Tape Letters. There are all these pleasures that are just there to enjoy, right? Eating, washing, drinking, right? And these things, yeah, leave aside for a moment what happens when you're deprived of them. But imagine that you could have been deprived of them totally, right? They could not have been before you at all. And your desire for them, right, should be like the desire of God, right? And this is something that Traherne is also really big on, is that God, unlike the gods of the pagans who are sort of impassive and beyond all desire, God wants things. That's why he makes them, right? He wants you. That's why he makes them. He wants your brother. That's why he made him, right? And so the minute you look at something, anything, as a thing that doesn't have to exist except that God is delighted that it should exist, right? suddenly your whole life can be joy, right? I mean, again, your whole life, with the exception of the really bad parts, which we were going to talk about, Traherne also transmutes those into joy, although it's a harder case. But that's the easy case, right? Let's talk about this Plato thing, because it's going to come back to haunt us in a bit. The ultimate source of this is Diogenes Laertius and the life of Socrates. And Traherne has these, left kind of a paper trail so that we know what he's talking about. It's not from the works of Plato directly. It's actually from this Socratic idea, and this is we've talked about Diogenes Laertius, right? He's the biographer of the philosophers, and fanciful in some places, but also very useful and very good at kind of categorizing philosophers. And his Life of Socrates, this is book 2, chapter 5. He says he could afford to despise those who scoffed at him. He prided himself on his plain living and never asked a fee from anyone. He used to say that he most enjoyed the food which was least in need of condiment, and the drink which made him feel the least hankering for some other drink, that he was nearest to the gods in that he had the fewest wants. This may be seen from the comic poets, and so on and so forth. So the Socratic idea, which is adjacent to Traherne's idea, is that in the height of contemplation, right, to have a thing without possessing a thing, right? God does not make we often say God made us for himself. And sometimes we say this in a very fire and brimstone sort of way that seems to me to imply that God has some kind of, I don't know, grasping, he just wants you, he doesn't want you to be happy, he just wants you for himself, right? You serve at his pleasure and screw you, basically. And I'm exaggerating, but only a little bit, right? Traherne's idea is totally different. He's saying God, because he has this blepane sight, because he looks with the eye of the heart, because he can blepe directly, right, out of the heart and into the heart. His perfect enjoyment is to see the thing as it is, as he has made it. Our perfect enjoyment, right, is to delight in the thing as God has made it and to conform our delight to God's delight. This is what it means, right, that all things work out to the good for them that love God, right? What does it mean to love somebody? It means to love that person's good, right? And the good of God is exactly what he does. And what he does is create things. And when he creates things, he gives them all to us, right? By giving us perception, by giving us an eye, right? By giving us not just one physical eye, but sight, right? In that gift, he gives us the entire world. And not only that, but he gives us our brother, who also is the entire world made anew, right? That this is like that hymn, evermore from his store, new worlds rise up to adore. Well, the world looks somewhat different to your best friend than it does to you. And the joy of your friendship is precisely in delighting in those differences, right? And receiving the world exactly as it is for him, right? And knowing it in that friendship. And this is why, as Lewis reminds us, right, the angels in Isaiah cry out, holy, 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 to each other, right? That they redouble their beatific vision by sharing it with one another. And so Traherne basically says, like, not only is the whole world, including my brother, for me, but I am part of the world that is given to my brother. And both are true. That it's not a zero-sum game, right? Like, I am both a kind of object of delight in my brother's eyes, and I am the recipient, seated in a perfect throne of repose, right? Receiving all these things. If you can receive them without possessing, right? Without owning the grass or the sky, right? Then you've uncovered basically the whole trick to life, right? And for Traherne, this is what it means that God has given us the whole world. Not that we're going to be rich or happy. And this is why Socrates, right, because he loves contemplation, can go without all these other things that everybody else scrabbles after, that Traherne calls invented values, right? Invented good things. You can be happy without those things if delighting in them means encountering them, right? This is the kind of idea that he has of holy poverty. So, okay, let's get back to the Sermon on the Mount, because we have more to say, right? We're only up to verse 5, right? But we've kind of, again, what I'm trying to do here is understand how what's there in the gospel, but sometimes lost in translation, comes to light in the vision of Traherne, right? So, verse 5, when thou prayest, thou shalt not be as the hypocrites are. This is that word, hypocritai, right? Those who act. You shall not be as the hypocrites are, for they love to pray standing in the synagogues and in the corners of the streets, that they may be seen of men. Hopos phanosin tois anthropos. Now we're going to get back to that too, that they may be seen of men. But notice that in the translation, we don't get any of these differences. We've had 3 words for seeing and being seen, right? We've had theathenai, to be looked upon, to be contemplated as a spectacle, and therefore to concern yourself with how you come across, how you look, rather than with what is actually good. And then blepein, which is God's kind of sight in the heart, from the heart to the heart. And now we have phanosin, which we're going to get back to. So they pray in the streets that they may be seen of men. Verily I say unto you, they have their reward. Apechusin ton mislan auton. This is this repetition, right? Phanosin, what does this mean? Well, we've encountered this word before. Remember when I talked about sosdein ta phenomena, to save the appearances? What that means is to save our understanding, to rehabilitate our understanding of the way things strike our senses. And so ta phenomena are the things that strike our senses. They are not the things in themselves, but they are the emanations, if you like. They are the way that those things make contact with our perceptive faculties. And one of the fundamental things that I keep stressing, right, is that that's two different things, right? That's the thing itself, to which I have no unmediated access, and then the thing's relationship to me. And Traherne might say, well, yes, because God has given it to you by putting it in relationship with you, right? He has not given it to you in its, kind of God's eye view, which is kind of what we seek in our scientism. But he has given it to you in the senses, right? Via your senses, via your experience of the thing. And so they do this, again, prostotheathenai, right? So that they can be looked at. Or in this saying, hopos phanosin, so that they may appear, so that they may be visible before men. And so this concern with the outward show, right? It turns out, ultimately, is actually an inward concern. It feels like a concern that's directed outward at somebody, but it's actually looking back in on yourself, which is one of the things that is fundamentally impossible, right? How can the eye look back upon itself, except by a kind of self-consciousness or self-knowledge? But to lose that, right? To look outside and to delight in the thing as it is being given to you by God is the entire shift in attitude, right, that transforms the mind, that turns the world into a good gift from God. And so we find, once we start to unpack this sermon, we find this entire concern threaded through it of kinds of seeming, kinds of looking, kinds of appearance, and basically this divide between two different ways of seeing and being seen, right? But thou, when thou prayest, enter into thy closet, eistotameon su. And when thou hast shut thy door, pray to thy Father which is in secret, and thy Father which seeth in secret shall reward thee openly. Kai hopater su hoplepon ento krypto apodose soi. This is again a sort of repeated phrase, and we've had this, we're now familiar with this. Hoplepon ento krypto, the one who sees in the unseen, right, in the hidden. This is, again, very profound, right? The one who sees in the unseen. What does this mean? He sees us, right, in the act that we do not look upon ourselves doing, right? In the thing that involves total self-forgetfulness that turns our eyes away from ourselves. We cannot blepein upon the inner life of ourselves, but what we can do is get some way toward blepeining, right? Toward looking directly at the other, right? At the thing that God has given to us now, the person in need, the person in joy, right? Rejoice with the rejoicing, mourn with those who mourn. And, whatever it is, right? Whatever God has given you, to look outward on it is to become an object of God's delight, right? When ye pray, use not vain repetitions, as the heathens do, for they think that they shall be heard for their much speaking. Proseo chamenoi de me batalogesete. Hos per hoi ethnikoi. Ethnikos is basically the Greek translation of goy. And if you've heard, you still hear goyim, right? The goyim are the non-Jews, right? The goyim are the outsiders. And actually, goy just means a people, right? A kind of race or a nation. And so the Jews are a goy, but the goyim are like all the other goys, right? So the other goys, right? Hoi ethnikoi, they do this kind of ritualistic prayer. And this is true, right? Of course, that there is this, you have to repeat the right words in Roman religion, say, right? There's this orthopraxy. You have to put the thing here and do the thing there and say the right thing. Dokusingar, they think, hoti ente polulogia, in their much speaking, in their many words, ente polulogia auton, esakuthe santai, they shall be heard, right? What a remarkable thing, right? They think that by saying words, they will be heard. Well, right? But no, because we're dealing here with a kind of hearing, just like we're dealing with a kind of sight, right? That is already inward, right? For be ye not therefore like unto them, for your Father knoweth what things ye have need of before ye ask him. Me un homoiothe te autois, Oidengar, ho pater humon. Now, oiden is a word for knowing, right, which also has close links to the word for seeing, right? Your father knows your needs. Humon hon krean echete, that of which you have need. Pro tu humas aitesai auton. Now, this is another mysterious verse because, well, okay, so, prayer does change things, right? I've prayed for things, and I believe that has affected the course of life. If God already knew I wanted it, why didn't he just give it to me or not, depending on what he wants, right? Like, why do I have to engage in prayer? Traherne will help us to answer that question as well. You guys know I'm pretty skeptical of supplements. I like to eat real food. And so it took me a while to find a supplement that I could recommend to you. And that's because Field of Greens really isn't a supplement in the way that you would think about it. It's not some sort of fake, extract or chemical or something. What it really is a full spectrum of essential vegetables and fruits to help you get the servings of those things that you need. Plus, it's got science-backed herbs and prebiotics. It can be really hard in a day, almost impossible to chug down as much, as many greens as you ought to be eating. And that's why Field of Greens is a fantastic addition to your diet. It really, when you're trying to eat healthy, trying to eat clean, it can be hard to get all of this stuff in, especially every day. I have really loved seeing the results of Field of Greens, clearer skin, just more energy throughout the day. And it has a kind of cumulative effect as well. So if you get a bunch of it and then you incorporate it into your daily routine, super easy, super convenient, you will start to see results really quickly. To help you get started, I got you 15% off your first order and another 10% when you subscribe for recurring orders. Visit fieldofgreens.com and use the promo code Heretics to get this deal. Fieldofgreens.com, promo code Heretics for 15% off your first order and another 10% off when you subscribe. Okay, we're in the 4th century now, and we're in section 9. And remember, we're talking about this question, what is the use of prayer? Why would you pray if God already knows? And he has this intimate heart knowledge, right? The heathens think of themselves as in a kind of human relationship, right? That they will be heard in their words, and that they have to inform the gods, right, of things that they need. This sort of absurdity of engaging, which is an absurdity when you think about it, right? Of engaging with God, who is beyond all time and space and beyond thought and words, right? Engaging him the way that you would engage a human being, that is through the medium of the senses and of auditory communication. So, okay, then why pray? Here's Traherne. Once more, we will distinguish of Christians. In the 4th century, he sort of divides Christians into different camps. And there's kind of he doesn't put it this way. He's not crass enough to put it this way, but I'll be crass for him. There's good Christians and bad Christians, basically. So we will distinguish of Christians. There are Christians that place and desire all their happiness in another life. And there is another sort of Christians that desire happiness in this. The one can defer their enjoyment of wisdom till the world to come and dispense with the increase in perfection of knowledge for a little time. God make me perfect, but not yet, right? Is the famous joke. The other are instant and impatient of delay, and would fain see that happiness here, which they shall enjoy hereafter. Not the vain happiness of this world, falsely called happiness, truly vain, but the real joy and glory of the blessed, which consisteth in the enjoyment of the whole world in communion with God. Not this only, but the invisible and eternal, which they earnestly covet to enjoy immediately, for which reason they daily pray, thy kingdom come, and travail towards it by learning wisdom as fast as they can. Whether the first sort be Christians indeed, look you to that. They have much to say for themselves. Yet certainly they put off felicity with long delays. They that do so are much to be suspected, for it is against the nature of love and desire to defer. Nor can any reason be given why they should desire it at last and not now. If they say because God hath commanded them, that is false, for he offereth it now. Now they are commanded to have their full conversation in heaven. Now they may be full of joy and full of glory. Ye are not straitened in me, but in your own bowels. Those Christians that can defer their felicity may be contented with their ignorance. He's saying if heaven is not the kind of thing that you are going to enjoy here on earth, then it's certainly not the kind of thing that you're going to be inclined to enjoy after death, right? Effectively, right, this is the kingdom of heaven is among you now. And praying thy kingdom come, right, longing for the coming of the kingdom, is making real the fact of the kingdom's already being here. How can this be? What does this mean? Well, when we long for the kingdom to come, right, when you desire what God desires, then you have aligned your vision in this 180 switch, right, with his desire, right, the things that he wants. So it's not that God doesn't already want these things for you. It's that you have to want them for yourself, right? For Traherne, wanting, which is outward directed, right, is a big part of loving. And so this prayer, this Lord's Prayer, which he cites here, thy kingdom come, right, has nothing to do with what God wants, because God always and everywhere wants the same thing, right, which is the good, right? Has nothing to do with the will of God. It has to do with your will, right, being brought into alignment with God. And this is the form of prayer that Christians engage in when they pray the Lord's Prayer, which is incredibly profound, right? So let's read it now. Let's read the Lord's Prayer. You've probably heard it a million times. After this manner, therefore, pray ye, Our Father, which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Hutos un proseokeste humes. After this manner, pray ye, Pater hemon ho entois uranois, hagias theto to onoma su. Now, immediately, you are asking for something which is already the case. May your name be holy, right? Or be held in holiness, right? God's name is holy. So what does that mean? It means, let me now, right, in my, right in the here and now, value God above all else, right? That is the thing that enables me in the next word to say, thy kingdom come. That's the next thing that he says, right? Let hallowed be thy name, right? In me, right? I am the one who is out of joint, out of whack here. I am orienting my sight toward now, desiring what God desires. Thy kingdom come. And so asking for that, right, suddenly means that the things that are happening are good for you, right? Because in love of God, right, you have accepted now the thing that God is giving you. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. The prayer is its own answering, right? The thing that is happening is the manifestation on earth of what is always true in heaven, which is that God wills, desires utterly, and enjoys utterly all things that he has created. Now, again, I want to make a note here. I understand that the problem of pain and suffering is still looming over us. And it looks like we're probably going to get to that next week or in another episode. So stay tuned. It's not like I think that this answers every possible question, but it certainly, for me at least, unlocks the prayer, right? It makes every word suddenly make sense, right? Eltheto he basileasu, let your kingdom come. Genetheto ta thalemasu. These might easily be understood more as surrenders than as requests, right? Let your kingdom come. Eltheto, let it be, right? The thing that God desires, right, which is working itself out now, is the thing that I'm going to commit myself to wanting. Now we ask for stuff. After that mindset, right, has set in upon us. Give us this day our daily bread. Aorton hemon on epiousion dos hemin semeron, right? Give us the epiousion, the daily bread. It's not that God doesn't know you don't need things, right? And it's not that you're not supposed to want those things, right? It's that you are supposed to ask for them and want them out of your love for God and not out of your fear that he doesn't know what you want, right? It's not that you're informing him of something that you want. It's that you are incorporating your own longings, your own desires into his will, which is first, right? And you are in trust and in love, acknowledging that God already has incorporated your good into his will because he loves you, because he made you, right? It's an amazing, when you get down to it, right? It's an amazing knot of logic, right? This kind of perfect orientation, this 180 flip that the prayer itself occasions in you. And I want to read here a passage from Paul's letter to the Romans because it sort of speaks to this, and it's usually brushed over because it comes right before this really famous passage about everybody working together in the church, having different gifts and stuff. But what's interesting about that passage is that once you take this view of it, it suddenly opens up all this new meaning and profundity, whereas before it was kind of like, well, I mean, pagans knew this, right? Pagans knew that people can work together with different gifts. That's like, you just look at a sports team, look at an army, right? We know that how these things work. But this is what Paul says at the beginning of chapter 12 of the letter to the Romans. I urge you, brothers and sisters, parakolo un humas adelphoi, dia ton oiktirmon tu theu, in view of God's mercy, para stesai ta somata humon, thusions dosan hagian, ewa restan to theo. Offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship, which the Greek is tein logikein latreon humon. This is your, it's in the objective because you're offering it, right? This is your, the accusative case, rather. It's the object, it's the accusative case. Logikein latreon humon. This is your rational service. As a rational animal, this is the highest form. So it's actually not just, what do I, like, how do I clean my body or something? It's that your body is rightly offered to God as the offering of a rational animal when your logos, right, when your thought is turned toward the will of God, right, you become pleasing to God when God's will becomes pleasing to you, because that is the next thing that Paul says. He says, then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will, right? To thelema to theu, to agathon kai eu areston, the same word he just used about you, right? You are supposed to regard God's will as well-pleasing, and he will regard you as well-pleasing, right? And they're basically one and the same thing, right? In all the ways that we've just been describing. And this is what he calls a total renewal of the mind, in that Trahernian way that we've been describing, that 180 flip, right? Metamorphouste te anakainose tu naos, right? Be transformed by the renewing of your mind. The mind turns first, and then everything else comes, right? This is, again, like an astonishing strain of thought that is kind of lost, I think, in our reading of the New Testament. But yet it's totally there. It's right there in the Greek. The authors are very careful about the words that they choose to convey it, especially words about seeing, right, and thinking and knowing. And Traherne is uncovering it for us in precisely the way we need it right now, right? Right as we are thinking about the way that our sight, our perception, our conscious observation of the world interacts with the raw materials of creation, right? That there was, in the beginning, was the heavens and the earth was without form and void, right? God made a thing that has a kind of indeterminacy built into it, but then God said, let there be light, and there was light, right? And this light, right, which both makes our sight possible, and also, it turns out, stitches the fabric of the world together so that anything that we see can cohere, right? Is an amazing, like, expression in the gospel and in Genesis and in Scripture, right, of exactly what science is suggesting to us as you and I speak, what is being uncovered, right? Okay, let's finish up the Lord's Prayer, and then we'll do a mailbag question, and then we will be sort of luxuriating in these texts for some time to come. So we'll pick it up next week. Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. Afes hemin ta aphelema ta hemon. Forgive us our trespasses, our debts, and lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever. Amen. Kai me esenenkes hemas es perasmon ala rusai hemas apatut poneru. If you forgive men their trespasses, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. But if you forgive not men their trespasses, neither will your Father forgive your trespasses. That's the end of the Lord's Prayer and a commentary upon it from Jesus. We're going to end on a cliffhanger here, because this is going to be just as there is a reciprocal relationship between wanting what God wants, seeing the world the way God sees it, and being seen by God as well-pleasing. There's also a reciprocal relationship between forgiving your brother and being forgiven by God. And this is what's going to start to get us into the messy and the ugly stuff, right? So far, I've just been talking about the joy of it all and the good stuff, the world as it was meant to work. But we know, as I have stressed over and over again, I think that the world does not work as it was meant to work. There's all sorts of sin and suffering and sorrow, and this is where forgiveness enters in. And forgiveness and the cross are going to be Traherne's answer to how this same form of sight and joy can be taken even into the depths of despair and death. Tune in next week to find out. Let's do a mailbag question. Mailbag questions come to me on Locals. youngheretics.com/locals is where you can find our community. Come join us. Come be on this little island of sanity in the midst of a world gone mad. The VIPs are a really cool bunch, and I've really loved getting to know them over the lifespan of this show. And we do a live stream Q&A every week where we get to kind of chat and I get to hear what's on your mind. And it really helps me actually to know what to talk about, because there's like so much stuff that you could talk about. But, for example, this episode, when we did the series on Barfield and quantum physics and all that stuff, people were like really into that one. And it was great to hear that, because I want to deliver stuff that's helpful to you. And I think that Traherne's been really helpful to me. I love sharing it. I love sharing it more deeply with the VIPs on Locals. They get episodes a week in advance, and they get to be in the mailbag. So come join us. Here's Tyler. The cultural fascination with the world of organized crime fascinates me. In reality, there's not a lot to admire. They coerce, kill, end families, lie, steal, and display a naked ambition for power. And yet the stories we tell about them show a devotion to a craft, priority to family, a simple faith that says, God protect me, even if not, God lead me. Aspects of masculinity and femininity are kept intact, although they may be poisoned versions, rags to riches, etc. I'm thinking of The Godfather, as I assume you are too, and Breaking Bad, right? And even some of the earlier bad boy stories from like Dashiell Hammett that we've covered on the show. We know intuitively the evil here, and yet part of us wants them to win. I've always thought of Scarface. Oh, Scarface. Okay, yeah. For example, as a tragic cycle, we know Tony must inevitably fall, but we're still sad for him when he does. Why do you think we are so drawn to these stories we would never advocate as paths for our sons? Okay, this is a great question. I kind of wish that I had had this question when we were doing Aristotle and the development of the Athenian constitution, because I was talking there about tribalism, right, and mob bosses and gangs, and the oldest thing in the book, right? And so part of it has to do with its being the oldest thing in the book, that it's actually a later and refined and more civilized way of doing things, to have that isonomia, to have that equality of law, or to have a law to which you refer, rather than to come to Don Corleone for justice, right? That's the whole point of the opening of scene of that movie encapsulates, I think, a lot of what we yearn for. Think about The Godfather. The Corleones have come to America. Many Italians have come to America, right? And they have left a country in which, in many places, right? If you read like modern Italian novels, like the Neapolitan Quartet by Elena Ferrante, kind of really dramatizes this well, that like even efforts to get out of the cycle of violence kind of end up back in the cycle of violence. And so you have this, like these towns, these, where you heard, you kill my goat and then I steal your daughter, and then the family is now anew, but suddenly violence from your son, right? This whole thing. And there is something earthy, right, about that. There's something very vital. There are vital energies that we get disconnected from the more we kind of abstract away into these pure forms of justice. And that's the point. That's why The Godfather is, in some sense, the great assimilation story, or the story, at least, of the great assimilation anxiety story. And you can kind of hold it up against Get Out, which is the more recent kind of social horror, the Jordan Peele movie. Two stories about the anxiety of assimilation, right? And of the things that you lose, right, by stripping yourself of these local particularities, these devotions and these allegiances, right? You don't even call me Godfather. That whole scene, it's all in there, right? And Michael's kind of journey. Remember, he comes back wearing the uniform, right? He comes back to that wedding. Al Pacino, young Al Pacino, very dashing, wearing that military uniform. That's the symbol, right, of kind of dissolving some part of your individuality or your national heritage in the acid bath of assimilation. And there are good and bad versions of this, and we've talked on the show about the fact that it is possible to maintain a kind of connection to these earthy forces and desires while still affirming America as a creation. America is actually not a landless or a peopleless nation, despite what you may have heard. But undeniably, the assimilation story, the immigration story is in part the story of traveling away from your old tribal allegiances and into a new world. And that new world, unless it retains some of those old ways of living, those cultural traditions, is likely to seem very cold and empty. And this is why masculinity and femininity, which have these real urgent characters to them, are part of what gets stripped away in a hyper-modern era, right? So I think that's a big part of what we're responding to, and that especially the masculinity part of it, which I've talked about a lot before, the virtu, which is not so much ethical virtue as just the sheer force of daring do, which can be oriented in one way or another. And this is why Aeschylus Eumenides is a great text, because it's not about rejecting or exiling the Furies, these kind of forces of chthonic underground power and attachment and recrimination. It's about converting them, right? It's about baptizing them in some sense, although of course they wouldn't have put it that way, right? It's about transforming them and orienting them in the right direction toward, finding the right outlet for your masculine anger and thumos, right? Finding the right outlet for your feminine care, right? These sorts of things, and your family attachments, right? and how to integrate those into a society where the law is sort of detached from all of that, as indeed it must be, to be a neutral arbiter. These things are never perfect, right? But we do travel toward them, and that's what the last week's episode was kind of about, just as the Eumenides is kind of about that. And I think that our yearning for these bad boy stories and these guys, this kind of raw masculinity, which we recognize as admirable, even when it's not virtuous, right? Like when Walter White kind of takes control of his life, there's something that we cheer for, as you say, even though we know that he's doing something terribly wrong that we condemn. It's because there's something missing from his life beforehand. And ideally, right, what you need is to recover that thing, but integrate it into the goods of civilized life. But when you're so far down the road of civilization and its discontents, sometimes the rawness and the urgency of something like a Godfather story can appeal. All right. Thanks for that question. Nicely ties into last week's episode. And thanks, as always, for being here with me. It is such a joy. If you like this work, you will like the Claremont Institute, which is where I work. We put out 2 publications, the Claremont Review of Books and the American Mind. And you can find them both online. You can also get the Claremont Review of Books, rather, in physical copy form. And you can donate to support us at claremont.org/donate. Mention in the notes that you heard about Claremont through Young Heretics. Don't forget to give us a 5-star review, or at least keep your bad opinions to yourself. And I will see you next week for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.